Hmm. Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine standing at the edge of the ancient world, the warm Mediterranean breeze brushing against your skin, the smell of salt and papyrus drifting through the air, and before you, rising like a dream carved in marble and stone, the greatest library the world has ever known. Welcome back to Obsidian Study, where we slow down, breathe, and let history wash over us like a gentle tide. I'm so glad you're here tonight, or this afternoon, or whenever it is that you've decided to rest your eyes and let your mind wander somewhere beautiful. Before we begin, and I really mean this, if this is your first time here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, and maybe tap the like button too, because here's the thing, you might fall asleep before this video ends, and honestly, that is the whole point, so do it now while you're still awake enough to find the button. We'll be here when you wake up. Now, settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, let your shoulders drop, let your jaw unclench, and let me take you somewhere that no longer exists, but once held the entire weight of human knowledge within its walls. We're going to Alexandria. Not the Alexandria of today, though that city is beautiful in its own right. We're going back, way back, to a time when the world was younger, when the stars felt closer, and when one city dared to dream the most ambitious dream in all of human history. The dream was simple, really. Collect every book ever written, every scroll, every piece of knowledge from every corner of the known world. Put it all in one place, and let the greatest minds of the age come and think and wonder and discover. That was the dream of Alexandria, and for a few shining centuries, it almost worked. The story of the Library of Alexandria is not just a story about books. It's a story about what happens when human beings reach for something extraordinary. It's a story about ambition and wonder and the terrifying fragility of everything we build. It's a story about how knowledge can be gathered, celebrated, and then, slowly, heartbreakingly, lost. So let's begin at the very beginning. Let's go back to the man who started it all. A young king, barely more than a boy, who looked out at the world and decided he wanted all of it. His name was Alexander.
Alexander the Great. Even saying that name feels like something, doesn't it? There's a weight to it, a kind of electricity. He was born in 356 BCE in a small kingdom called Macedon in what is now northern Greece. His father was Philip II, a brilliant military strategist. His mother was Olympias, a fierce and deeply spiritual woman who believed her son was destined for something beyond ordinary greatness. And his teacher was Aristotle. Let that sink in for a moment. One of the greatest conquerors in history was personally tutored by one of the greatest philosophers in history. Aristotle taught young Alexander about science, medicine, philosophy, literature, and the nature of the world. He gave Alexander not just knowledge, but a love of knowledge, a hunger for it, and that hunger never left him. When Alexander began his campaigns of conquest, sweeping across Persia, Egypt, Central Asia, and into the edges of India, he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought scholars, scientists, historians, botanists. He wanted to understand every land he conquered, not just rule it. When he arrived in Egypt in 332 BCE, something shifted in him. Egypt was ancient even then. Its pyramids were already 2,000 years old. Its priests held knowledge that stretched back into the mists of time. And Alexander, young, brilliant, restless Alexander, was in awe. He founded a city on the Egyptian coast, right where the Nile meets the Mediterranean Sea. He laid out the streets himself, they say, using grain because he had no chalk, and he named it after himself, Alexandria. He never really got to see it finished. He left Egypt and continued his campaigns, pushing further and further east, until his body finally gave out in Babylon in 323 BCE. He was 32 years old, but the city he planted on that Egyptian shore, it grew. Oh, it grew into something he could never have imagined. After Alexander died, his empire was divided among his generals. Egypt fell to a man named Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions and most trusted officers. And Ptolemy had inherited something of Alexander's love for knowledge. He looked at this new city, this Alexandria, and he saw potential, not just as a port, not just as a center of trade, but as something the world had never seen before, a center of learning, a beacon of knowledge, a place where the greatest minds could gather and think and write and discover, supported by the wealth of one of the richest kingdoms in the ancient world. And so the dream began to take shape. Ptolemy brought scholars to Alexandria. He built a place called the Mausoleon, which means something like home of the muses, the goddesses of art and learning. It was a kind of ancient university with lecture halls and gardens and dining rooms where scholars could eat together and argue about philosophy over their meals. And attached to the Mausoleon was the library. Just breathe for a moment. Picture it. A great hall, or perhaps many halls, lined with wooden shelves. And on those shelves, thousands upon thousands of papyrus scrolls, each one carefully labeled, each one containing something precious. A poem, a mathematical proof, a medical treatise, a history, a play, a philosophical argument that had been turning in someone's mind for years before they finally wrote it down. This was the beginning of the Library of Alexandria, and it was only going to grow. The Ptolemies were remarkable rulers in many ways, but perhaps their most remarkable quality was their obsession with books. Ptolemy I started the collection, but it was his son, Ptolemy II, who really threw open the doors and said, "Bring me everything," and he meant it. Ptolemy II sent letters to every king, every ruler, every scholar he could reach. He asked them to send books. Any books, all books. He wanted copies of everything that had ever been written. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, poetry, drama, history, agriculture, military strategy. It didn't matter. He wanted it all. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched. If any passenger was carrying a scroll, it was taken to the library to be copied. Sometimes the original was kept and the copy was given back to the owner. Sometimes the original just stayed. There's a wonderful story, and I love this story, about how Ptolemy III borrowed the official Athenian copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were the master copies, the most authoritative versions of some of the greatest plays ever written. Athens lent them only because Ptolemy put up an enormous deposit of silver as a guarantee he would return them. He kept the originals, he sent back beautiful copies, and he forfeited the silver without a second thought. That tells you something about how much these books meant to them. The library grew and grew. Estimates vary wildly because we don't have precise records, but scholars believe the library may have held anywhere from 40,000 to 700,000 scrolls at its height. The exact number doesn't really matter. What matters is the scale of the ambition. This was an attempt to gather all human knowledge in one place, and they came remarkably close. The library attracted the greatest minds of the ancient world. Scholars came from Greece, from Persia, from Egypt, from across the Mediterranean. They came because Alexandria offered something extraordinary. Access to texts they could never find anywhere else. Access to other brilliant minds. Access to the resources of a wealthy and supportive royal court. Let me tell you about some of the people who walked those halls, because these weren't just names in a history book. These were real human beings, curious and passionate, and sometimes wonderfully strange, who changed the way we understand the world. There was Euclid, who wrote a book called The Elements, which laid out the foundations of geometry so clearly and so completely that it was still being used as a textbook in schools 2,000 years later. 2,000 years, think about that. There was Archimedes, who may have studied in Alexandria before returning to his home in Syracuse. He figured out how to calculate the area of a circle, discovered principles of buoyancy that we still use today, and reportedly once said, "Give me a lever long enough and a place to stand, and I will move the world." There was Eratosthenes, who became the chief librarian of Alexandria and who did something almost impossibly clever. He calculated the circumference of the earth. In the 3rd century BCE, without leaving Egypt, he did it by measuring the angle of the sun's shadow in 2 different cities at the same time and using geometry to work out the rest. His answer was remarkably close to the actual number. Let that settle over you. More than 2,000 years ago, a man in a library in Egypt figured out how big our planet is. Using sticks and shadows and mathematics, that is what Alexandria made possible. Alexandria itself was extraordinary, not just the library. Let's wander through the city for a moment, because understanding the city helps us understand why the library mattered so much. Alexandria was built on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a lake called Lake Mareotis. It had 2 magnificent harbors, one facing the sea and one facing the lake, which made it one of the greatest trading ports in the ancient world. Ships came from Rome, from Greece, from Carthage, from Arabia, from India. The docks were always busy, always loud, always smelling of fish and spice and timber, and the particular sharp smell of the sea. The city was laid out in a grid, which was unusual for ancient cities. Wide boulevards ran from east to west and north to south. The main street, called the Canopic Way, was reportedly wide enough for several chariots to ride side by side. It was lined with colonnades, those beautiful rows of columns that gave shade in the fierce Egyptian sun. The population of Alexandria at its height may have been close to 1 million people. That made it one of the largest cities in the ancient world, rivaling Rome itself. And it was extraordinarily diverse. Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Persians, Syrians, Romans, people from every corner of the Mediterranean world lived and worked and argued and traded in Alexandria's streets. This diversity was part of what made the city so intellectually alive. When you put people from different cultures together, when their ideas rub up against each other, something happens. New thoughts emerge, old assumptions get questioned, the world gets a little bigger. And then there was the Pharos. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It stood on a small island called Pharos, connected to the city by a long causeway, and it rose to a height of somewhere between 100 and 140 meters. That's roughly the height of a 40-story building. At its top burned a great fire, and behind the fire was a system of mirrors that reflected the light out to sea. Ships could see it from miles away. It guided them safely into harbor. It was a beacon in the most literal sense of the word. And isn't that a beautiful metaphor? The city that housed the greatest library in the world also built the greatest lighthouse in the world. A city of light. A city that said to the darkness, "Come no closer. We are here. We are thinking. We are learning." The library and the lighthouse. Knowledge and guidance, both reaching upward, both trying to push back the dark. Breathe in and breathe out. Let the image of that ancient city settle around you. The warm stone streets, the sound of the harbor, the smell of papyrus and lamp oil drifting from the library's open doors, scholars walking in the gardens of the Mausyan, arguing gently about the nature of the stars, the distant flash of the Pharos light sweeping across the dark water. It was real. All of it was real. And for a few centuries, it was the most remarkable place on earth. Let's go deeper into the library now. Let's meet a few more of the people who lived and worked there, because their stories are so human, so warm, so full of the particular joy of someone who has found exactly the thing they were meant to do. Hypatia. I want to tell you about Hypatia. She lived much later than the library's golden age, in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, when Alexandria was already a changed city. But she is perhaps the most famous scholar ever associated with Alexandria, and her story is one of the most moving in all of ancient history. Hypatia was a mathematician, an astronomer, and a philosopher. She was the daughter of a mathematician named Theon, who was himself a scholar of considerable reputation. She grew up surrounded by books and ideas, and she became one of the most respected teachers in Alexandria. Students came from across the Mediterranean to study with her. She taught Neoplatonic philosophy, which was a school of thought that tried to understand the nature of reality and the divine through reason and contemplation. She wrote commentaries on mathematical texts. She may have helped develop or refine the astrolabe, an instrument used to measure the positions of stars. And she was a woman. In a world that rarely gave women access to education, let alone positions of intellectual authority, Hypatia stood at the center of Alexandrian intellectual life. People wrote to her for advice. Governors consulted her. She walked through the city in her scholar's cloak and spoke openly in public about philosophy and mathematics. There's something deeply moving about that image. A woman in the ancient world walking freely through a great city, her mind full of stars and numbers and the deep questions of existence. Her story does not end happily. We'll come to that. But for now, let's just sit with the image of her, teaching, thinking, living fully in the life of the mind. There was also Claudius Ptolemy, no relation to the royal family, who worked in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE and produced 2 works that would shape human understanding for over 1,000 years. His Almagest was a comprehensive mathematical model of the movements of the stars and planets. His geography was an attempt to map the known world, complete with coordinates and projections. Both works were eventually lost to the Western world and preserved by Arab scholars, who translated them into Arabic and kept them alive through the centuries when Europe had largely forgotten them. We'll come back to that too, because it's one of the most important parts of this story. And there was Hero of Alexandria, a mathematician and engineer who invented things that seem almost impossibly modern for his time. He designed a simple steam engine called the Aeolipile, which used steam pressure to spin a metal ball. He created automatic doors for a temple, operated by heat and air pressure. He designed a programmable cart, a kind of ancient robot that could follow a preset path. A steam engine in the 1st century CE. Imagine if that technology had been developed further. Imagine if the Industrial Revolution had happened 1,500 years earlier. The world would be unrecognizable. But it wasn't developed further, and that is one of the great quiet tragedies of history. Not a dramatic destruction, not a single catastrophic moment, but a slow failure to follow through. A technology demonstrated and then set aside. A door opened and then gently, almost accidentally closed. The library was full of such moments, full of ideas that were almost grasped, almost developed, almost carried forward into something world-changing, and then not. Here is where the story gets a little harder, a little sadder. But I want you to stay with me because there is something important in the sadness, something worth understanding. The decline of the Library of Alexandria was not a single event. This is one of the most common misconceptions about this story. People imagine a great fire, a single catastrophic night when everything was lost. And while fire did play a role, the truth is more complicated and in some ways more heartbreaking. The library declined slowly, over centuries, through a combination of neglect, political upheaval, changing priorities, and yes, some violence. It was a long, slow fading, like a candle burning down rather than being suddenly blown out. Let's trace it carefully. The first major blow came in 48 BCE when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria. Egypt was in the middle of a civil war between the young Queen Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy III. Caesar became involved, as Caesar tended to do, and there was fighting in the harbor. During the fighting, Caesar ordered his ships to be set on fire to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The fire spread, and according to some ancient sources, it reached warehouses near the harbor that were storing scrolls, possibly scrolls that had been collected for the library or were waiting to be transported there. How many scrolls were lost? We don't know. Some ancient writers say 40,000. Others say the damage was minimal. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the library itself, the main building, may not have been directly affected. But it was a wound, a reminder of how fragile all of this was. Breathe. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you're resting. The library continued after Caesar. Cleopatra herself was a scholar, reportedly fluent in 9 languages, and she cared deeply about Alexandria's intellectual heritage. Mark Antony, her famous lover and ally, reportedly gave her 200,000 scrolls from the library at Pergamon to help replenish any losses. But the political world was shifting. Rome was becoming the dominant power in the Mediterranean. Egypt was becoming a Roman province. And Rome, for all its greatness, had a different relationship with knowledge than Alexandria did. Rome was practical. Rome built roads and aqueducts and legal systems. Rome was less interested in pure intellectual inquiry, in asking questions for the joy of asking them. The royal patronage that had sustained the library began to dry up. Scholars still came. The collection was still there. But the energy, the sense of urgent, joyful accumulation began to fade. Then came the 3rd century CE, a period of tremendous instability across the Roman Empire. Emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Wars were constant. Trade routes were disrupted. Cities that had been prosperous for centuries began to struggle. Alexandria suffered. In 270 CE, the Emperor Aurelian fought a battle in the city that destroyed a significant portion of the royal quarter, the area where the Mausion and possibly the main library building were located. How much was lost in that destruction? Again, we don't know precisely, but it was another wound. And then, in 391 CE, something happened that has been debated by historians ever since. The Emperor Theodosius issued edicts ordering the closure of pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. Christianity had become the official religion of Rome, and the old ways were being swept aside. In Alexandria, a Christian mob, possibly led or encouraged by the bishop Theophilus, attacked and destroyed the Serapeum, a great temple dedicated to the god Serapis. The Serapeum may have housed a secondary collection of library scrolls, a kind of overflow or branch library. If so, those scrolls were lost in the destruction. It's a complicated moment in history. The people who destroyed the Serapeum weren't simply villains. They were people caught up in a religious revolution, people who believed they were doing something righteous. History is rarely made by simple villains. It's made by human beings, complicated and passionate, and sometimes terribly wrong. But the loss was real. Whatever was in that building was gone. And then there was Hypatia. And I want to tell you this part gently, because it is a hard story, but it matters. In 415 CE, Hypatia was murdered. She was traveling through Alexandria in her carriage when a mob, associated with a group of Christian zealots called the Parabolani, stopped her. They dragged her from her carriage. They killed her, and they burned what remained. The details are brutal, and I won't dwell on them. What matters for our story is what her death represented. Hypatia was the last great scholar of the Alexandrian tradition. After her death, many of the remaining scholars in Alexandria left the city. The intellectual community that had sustained the library's spirit for centuries simply dispersed, scattered to other cities, other places, other lives. The library, or what remained of it, did not immediately disappear, but the community of scholars that gave it meaning was gone. A library without readers, without thinkers, without the living conversation of curious minds is just a building full of old paper. That's a thought worth sitting with. Knowledge isn't just stored in books. It lives in the people who read them, who argue about them, who build on them and pass them on. When the community of scholars died, something essential died with it. The final blow, or what is often described as the final blow, came in 642 CE, when Arab armies conquered Egypt. There is a famous story, probably apocryphal, that the Arab general Amr ibn al-As asked the Caliph Omar what to do with the library's remaining books. The Caliph supposedly replied, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are dangerous. Either way, burn them." Most historians today believe this story is a later invention, a piece of propaganda created centuries after the fact. The Arab conquest of Egypt was actually relatively peaceful, and Arab scholars of this period were deeply interested in preserving ancient knowledge, not destroying it. In fact, it was Arab scholars who saved much of what we know about ancient Alexandria. They translated Greek texts into Arabic. They preserved the works of Euclid and Ptolemy and Galen and Aristotle through the centuries when Europe had largely lost access to them. When the Renaissance came and European scholars began rediscovering ancient knowledge, Much of what they found had been kept alive by the Islamic world. That's a beautiful irony, isn't it? The people often blamed for destroying Alexandria's knowledge were actually among its most important preservers. The truth about the library's end is quieter and sadder than any dramatic story of burning. It faded. It was neglected. It was wounded by wars and politics and changing priorities. Its scholars left. Its scrolls deteriorated. And slowly, over centuries, the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled simply dissolved back into time. And now we come to the question that haunts this story. The question that keeps historians and dreamers awake at night. What was lost? We know some of what was in the library because ancient writers mentioned it. We know there were copies of plays by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And we know that of the hundreds of plays these three men wrote, we have only a tiny fraction today. Aeschylus wrote around 90 plays. We have 7. Sophocles wrote over 100. We have 7. Euripides wrote around 90. We have 18. The rest are gone. Titles survive sometimes. A fragment here, a quotation there. But the plays themselves, the full living works, are lost. There were scientific texts, medical texts, mathematical texts, philosophical works, histories of civilizations that no longer exist, written by people whose names we barely remember. There was a work by Aristarchus of Samos, who proposed in the 3rd century BCE that the Earth revolves around the sun, not Copernicus in the 16th century. Aristarchus, 1800 years earlier. His main work on this subject is lost. We know about his heliocentric model only because other ancient writers mentioned it. Imagine if that idea had been preserved and developed. Imagine if the heliocentric model had been accepted and built upon in the ancient world. Where would astronomy be today? Where would science be? There were works on engineering, on mechanics, on the properties of materials. Hero of Alexandria's steam engine was described in a text that survived. But what other engineering knowledge was lost? What other technologies were described in scrolls that no longer exist? We don't know. And that's the most haunting part. We don't know what we don't know. We can't mourn specific losses because we don't know what's missing. We only know that the gap between what the ancient world knew and what survived into the medieval period is enormous. And somewhere in that gap is the Library of Alexandria. There's a particular kind of grief for lost knowledge. It's different from other kinds of grief. When a person dies, we know who they were. We can remember them. We can mourn them specifically. But when knowledge is lost, we often don't even know it's gone. We just live in a world that is slightly smaller, slightly darker than it might have been. Breathe. Let that thought move through you, and then let it go. Because here is the other side of this story. Here is the part that I find genuinely comforting. Not everything was lost. The story of Alexandria is not only a story of loss, it is also, remarkably, a story of survival. Think about what we do have. We have Euclid's Elements, all 13 books of it, one of the most influential mathematical texts ever written. We have the works of Archimedes, preserved through Byzantine and Arab copies. We have Ptolemy's Almagest in geography. We have the medical works of Galen, who worked in Rome, but whose ideas were deeply shaped by the Alexandrian tradition. We have the poems of Callimachus, who was a librarian at Alexandria and one of the greatest poets of the ancient world. We have the Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes, an epic poem about Jason and the Argonauts, written by another Alexandrian scholar. We have Euclid's Geometry. We have Eratosthenes' calculation of the Earth's circumference. We have Hero's descriptions of his inventions. We have fragments and quotations and references that give us glimpses of what was lost. And we have the tradition, the idea of the library, the dream of gathering all human knowledge in one place. That dream did not die with Alexandria. It was reborn again and again, in different forms, in different places. The great libraries of the Islamic world in Baghdad, in Cordoba, in Cairo, carried on the Alexandrian tradition. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, founded in the 8th century CE, was in many ways a direct heir to the Library of Alexandria. Scholars there translated Greek texts into Arabic, preserved them, built on them, and added their own discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. When the Renaissance came to Europe, it was partly because European scholars rediscovered ancient texts that had been preserved in Arabic translation. The knowledge that had been gathered in Alexandria, lost to the Western world, preserved in the Islamic world, came back, changed, enriched, built upon, but recognizably descended from those original scrolls. And then there were the monasteries. Christian monks in Ireland and England and across Europe copied manuscripts by hand, preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost entirely. It was painstaking, slow, sometimes misunderstood work. Monks copying texts they didn't fully understand, in languages they barely knew. But they copied them, and because they did, we have them. There's something deeply human about that. People preserving things they don't fully understand because they sense somehow that the things matter, that they should be kept, that someone someday will need them. And then, of course, there is the internet. We're living in a remarkable moment in history, a moment that would have seemed like pure magic to the scholars of ancient Alexandria. Right now, as you lie there listening to my voice, you have access to more information than the Library of Alexandria ever held, more than the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, more than all the libraries of the ancient world combined. It's in your pocket. It's on the device you're using to listen to this video. The internet is, in many ways, the fulfillment of the Alexandrian dream, the dream of gathering all human knowledge in one place and making it accessible to anyone who wants it. And like Alexandria, it is both magnificent and fragile. Websites disappear. Digital files become corrupted. Formats become obsolete. The internet is not as permanent as it seems. There are organizations like the Internet Archive that are working to preserve digital knowledge the way the ancient librarians worked to preserve scrolls. And they face many of the same challenges. Too much to save, too little time, too little funding, and the constant threat of loss. We haven't solved the problem that Alexandria faced. We've just moved it to a new medium. But there's something else the internet has given us that Alexandria never had. Copies, millions and millions of copies. When a text exists in only one place, it is terrifyingly vulnerable. One fire, one flood, one political upheaval, and it's gone. But when a text exists in a million places simultaneously, on servers across the world, in the hands of millions of readers, it becomes almost indestructible. The works of Shakespeare exist in so many copies, in so many languages, in so many formats, that they could never be truly lost. The same is true of the works of Tolstoy, of Jane Austen, of Homer. The copying that the ancient librarians did by hand, one scroll at a time, we now do automatically, instantly, at a scale that would have seemed miraculous. In that sense, we have learned from Alexandria's loss. We have built a world where knowledge is harder to destroy, but we should not be complacent. History has a way of surprising us. Civilizations that seem permanent have fallen. Technologies that seem indestructible have been lost. The scholars of Alexandria probably didn't think their library would disappear either. Let that be a gentle reminder, not a frightening one. A reminder to value knowledge, to share it, to pass it on, to be, in our own small ways, librarians of the things that matter.
We're getting close to the end of our journey now. Let your breathing slow a little more. Let the weight of your body settle. Let the story wrap around you like something warm. The Library of Alexandria is gone. The scrolls are dust. The building, whatever it looked like, has been buried under centuries of city and sand. The scholars who walked its halls are long returned to the earth. But something remains. It remains in every library that has ever been built, in every school, in every university, in every bookshop with its particular smell of paper and possibility, in every person who has ever stayed up too late reading something that changed the way they see the world. The dream of Alexandria, the dream of gathering knowledge and sharing it and building on it and passing it on, is one of the most persistent dreams in human history. It keeps being dreamed. It keeps being built. it keeps being lost and found and built again. And maybe that's the most important thing about the Library of Alexandria. Not what it contained, not even what was lost, but what it represented, what it said about human beings and what we are capable of when we decide that knowledge matters, when we decide that understanding the world is worth the effort, when we decide that the questions are worth asking even when the answers are hard. We are the inheritors of that dream, every one of us who has ever been curious about something, every one of us who has ever read a book or watched a documentary or listened to a video about ancient history while drifting off to sleep. We are the Library of Alexandria. We carry it with us, in our curiosity, in our questions, in our willingness to sit with a story and let it change us a little. The knowledge was never just in the scrolls. It was always in the people who read them. And it's in you. So rest now. Let the ancient city fade gently into the background of your mind. Let the Mediterranean breeze carry you somewhere quiet and warm. Let the sound of the harbor grow distant. Let the lamplight of the library dim slowly, slowly, like a candle burning down to its last beautiful flicker. You've traveled a long way tonight, from a young king laying out a city with grain on an Egyptian shore, to the greatest library the world has ever known, to the slow and complicated story of its fading, to the remarkable fact that here we are, thousands of years later, still telling the story, still caring about what was lost, still dreaming the dream. That matters. You matter. Your curiosity matters. Sleep well, friend. The library will be here when you wake up, and so will we. Good night from Obsidian Study. If you made it this far without falling asleep, you are truly remarkable, and we are so grateful you stayed. Come back anytime you need somewhere quiet to rest your mind. We'll always have a story waiting for you. Just for a little while longer, stay here with me. The library is quiet now. Not empty, not completely, just resting. The shelves no longer groan under the weight of countless scrolls. The voices of scholars have softened into something distant, like echoes carried on a breeze you can almost hear, but not quite. Walk slowly through the hall. Your fingers brush against the wood of the shelves, smooth in some places, worn in others. Time has touched everything here, gently, patiently. There is a softness to this place now, a kind of peace that wasn't there before. When the library was alive with voices, it was full of urgency. Questions needed answers. Ideas needed defending. Knowledge needed to be gathered, organized, protected. But now, all of that has quieted, and what remains is something simpler, the feeling of wonder, because even without the scrolls, even without the scholars, the idea of this place still lingers, a place where human beings believed that knowledge mattered, that understanding the world was worth the effort, that collecting ideas, fragile, fleeting thoughts, was something sacred. Breathe in, slowly, and out. Imagine a single scroll still resting somewhere in the room, just one. No one knows exactly what's written on it. It could be a poem, a theory, a question that was never fully answered. You unroll it gently. The ink is faded, but still there. Careful lines, written by a hand that lived thousands of years ago. A person who sat where you are now, thinking, wondering, trying to make sense of something just beyond their reach. And for a moment, across all that time, you are connected, not through the exact words, not even through complete understanding, but through something quieter, curiosity. That same quiet pull to know something more, to ask why, to look at the world and feel that small, persistent spark that says, there is more here. That spark is what built Alexandria. Not stone, not wealth, not power, curiosity. And that's why, even though the library is gone, it was never truly lost, because the thing that created it still exists. It exists in you. Let that thought settle. You don't need grand halls or endless shelves to carry that forward. You don't need to gather all knowledge or solve every mystery. Sometimes it's enough just to wonder, to pause, and let your mind drift towards something unknown, to sit with a question without rushing to answer it. That quiet space, that gentle openness is where the library still lives. Now the light is fading. The last glow of evening slips through the windows, stretching long shadows across the floor. The air cools. The silence deepens. Somewhere far away, the sea moves against the shore, slow, steady, endless. And here, in this place that once held the weight of the world's knowledge, there is nothing left to do, nothing to chase, nothing to gather, only rest. Let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, let the image of the library drift gently away, like mist dissolving in the morning light. You don't need to hold on to it. The story has already done its work. It has carried you here, to this quiet moment where everything is still, and that is enough. The last light fades, the halls grow dim, and somewhere, deep in the silence, the dream continues, softly, quietly, endlessly. Good night.